Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Raheem Thompson. I am the manager of public programs. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, and the entire museum, I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight for a very special book and author program. Tonight, we have the honor of having Dan Grunfeld, whose father, Ernie Grunfeld, was an NBA executive. He was also the only NBA player with parents who survived the Holocaust. Dan himself is an 8-year professional basketball player who played for Stanford University, who at one point was 26 and 0, I believe, and were ranked number one in the country. But today we're not only going to talk about basketball, we're going to talk about Dan's new book, By the Grace of the Game, The Holocaust, A Basketball Legacy and an Unprecedented American Dream. Before we start the program, I would like to thank all of our community partners who supported us, and I would like to thank everyone in attendance again, and I would like to welcome Dan to the program.
Hey, thanks so much. It's great to be here. I echo your thanks to those who joined tonight, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about this, and I just want to congratulate you on the book.
Thank you.
Extremely well written. It was fun to read. I read it in one sitting actually, and I believe at one point while reading it, I actually shot you an email like, "Hey, I thought this was really funny. This was really good." Yeah, and we're going to get into that. But let's start things off with your dad, because as much as this book is about basketball, it's also about your family and the legacy and the things you inherited because of your family and things that were brought in. And with your dad being an NBA executive, but also the only NBA player whose parents survived the Holocaust, both of your grandparents were survivors. But before your dad was a basketball sensation, he had to deal with things of becoming an immigrant. He had to learn a new language. He had to adapt to his environment. He had to overcome the loss of his brother, who was also his hero. Can you tell us about your father's upbringing in those early years of coming to the country, and also your grandparents?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, my dad's very well known in the world of sports, certainly in basketball. He's a high school legend, a college legend. He's a very good NBA player, and then was a 30-year NBA executive. So people know that history, but what they don't know is that he is the only player in NBA history whose parents are Holocaust survivors. And actually, the research suggests he's the only player in the history of the four major American sports leagues whose parents survived the Holocaust. And so, if you've ever heard my dad speak, he just sounds like a New Yorker. Because they fled Romania under duress and they came to Forest Hills, Queens, and so he sounds like a New Yorker. But people don't really know that his native language is Hungarian, and he grew up differently. Born out of the ashes of the Holocaust, again coming to America, losing his older brother, and just you mentioned that my uncle is my dad's hero. What my dad called my uncle in Hungarian translates to English into my king. That's how much he revered his brother, and so his brother passed away about a year after coming to the United States. And so my dad did what all the kids in New York City were doing. He went to the playground and for him, it was just a chance to make friends, to learn English and to heal from that loss. And he just started playing basketball. And I'll show you my book. It's called By the Grace of the Game. And then we titled it that for a reason. Basketball really shined its light on my family when we needed it, certainly for my dad. And so, he's had an incredible journey, became an Olympic gold medalist roughly a decade after coming to America. And I'm sure we'll get into all that. But, yeah, like you said, this isn't really a basketball book. It's a book that's bigger than basketball. It's about family. It's about legacy. It's about history. And it really starts with my grandparents. And everyone on the call will be happy to know that my grandmother is 96 years old, lives in the Bay Area, doing amazing. She still cooks big meals for me and my wife and our family. And if you read my book, you'll read a lot about her cooking. It's still as good as ever. And I always tell people, you do want to eat my grandmother's food and you do not want to play cards against her. She also plays bridge 5 times a week, and she's an excellent card player. But she is a big Holocaust survival story, as you know from reading the book. And my grandfather, who passed away when I was young, is a survivor as well. And so my grandma in particular, she's the star of the book, and she's really the star of our family.
Absolutely. And like you said, it is so much about the family history. And one of the things I took away was how self-aware you were about the book and honest. Like you immediately talk about being born into privilege,
Hmm.
thanks to your father's success, but in your own right, you put a lot of work in to carve your own lane. Can you talk about the balance of understanding what you were born into, but also choosing to find your own identity and pushing your family's name forward?
Without a doubt. And you said it, yeah, I'm very honest. When you write a book like this, you have to be vulnerable and be open, and I am. And I was born so much in circumstances that were so different from my grandparents and my dad. And that's what grandparents and parents want for future generations. You want to have more resources, more opportunities. And I certainly had that. But I also carry the history of my family. And I knew that, I have family members who didn't get a chance to try to live out their dreams. And so, yeah, there was always tension there, and particularly since my dad became this big basketball star and I was a basketball player. I mean, what kid doesn't want to be like their parents, because that's just a typical thing. And for me, my dad was an NBA player and he worked in the NBA. So of course that's what I wanted. And so I always felt that people, made assumptions about me or judged me because, my dad was kind of prominent in that space. And as you know, from reading the book, it gave me quite a big chip on my shoulder, and so it drove me to kind of prove people wrong, to work really hard. But that hard work is also the value of my family, right? Because when my grandparents came to the United States after surviving the Holocaust, after fleeing communism, they were all about hard work. They opened up a fabric store in the Bronx and built a life for themselves. And my dad was all about hard work as a basketball player. And that's how he went from this kid on the playgrounds who didn't speak English, who was getting made fun of and picked on, to the best player on the playground, then the best player in the city, then one of the best players in the country, not only in high school, but in college, And so I tried to apply that value in my career as well, and yeah, like you said, I'm really honest about some of those struggles and some of those challenges. But again, ultimately, like my grandparents, my parents couldn't be happier that I've had more resources and more opportunities, and neither can I. I'm very grateful for that. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of earn, earn my what came to me, and also kind of live up to that legacy and carry that forward.
Yeah, and speaking of like living up to the legacy, when did you fall in love with the game? But also, how much of that your dad's success impacted you or piqued your interest in wanting to play the game?
So as you know, because you read the book, I
Yeah,
was literally born around the game of basketball, and then
yeah,
I write about this, and it's one of the first things I write about, that my birth was planned in between two of my dad's road trips. So he was a player for the New York Knicks, and he had two long road trips, and I was delivered by C-section. And so, my dad went on a road trip. He was there for my birth. He went on another road trip, and then he was there for my bris. So I mean, when I say I was born into the game, I mean it literally, and it's in my blood. And so my earliest memories are, going to practice with my dad when he was a coach for the Knicks and then the general manager of the team, working on my game with him in our driveway and playing with him. And so, yeah, it's a great love that we shared and that we share today, that we'll always share. But it's deeper. It's deeper than that. And again, my book is called By the Grace of the Game. And kids are intuitive and perceptive. And I always had a sense of how much basketball had done for our family. With what my grandparents went through, what my dad went through in America to find basketball, and that's why it just meant so much to me. And I just, I was so driven to succeed, and I loved it so much and still do, because of how much it's meant to our family.
yeah, and it's interesting because basketball exposed you to so much. Like you mentioned, you moved around, and by the time you were ready to go to college, you chose your own path. You chose Stanford University. And could you talk about choosing to commit there? Like, why did you choose Stanford?
Yeah. So I wanted to go to Stanford since I was in seventh grade. My grandmother lives in the Bay Area currently and did back then. And so we were visiting her, and my older sister was looking at colleges. And so we went to Stanford to look. And my sister liked it. I loved it. I was obsessed. And, I grew up in northern New Jersey. And at that time, there wasn't really the internet. It's weird to say that, right? But there wasn't. And so I didn't know much about Stanford. But as soon as I saw it, I said, wow, it was a top 5 basketball program, one of the top schools in the world, and 25 minutes from my grandma. And I wanted to be a basketball player. So I said, this is where I'm going to play. And I made it my goal, but it was more like a mission. I mean, it wasn't anything casual. From that day, I was really set on it. And, as I progressed, my game progressed, I got bigger. Things just kind of happened for me. It was a combination of luck, some skill, some timing, everything kind of came together. And, it certainly as a seventh grader, it was a huge reach for me to say I wanted to play at Stanford. But even as a sophomore, junior in high school, it was a bit of a reach because it was a top program. But my game really came along at the right time. And again, my book is called By the Grace of the Game. And so, I was close to Stanford. I was one of their top recruits, but they hadn't offered me a scholarship yet. And I remember talking to my dad and just how stressed I was because I wanted it so bad. And I had played really well in certain situations, but they hadn't kind of committed to me yet. Me committing to them was easy. That was done when I was 12, but I wanted them to commit to me and it hadn't happened. And so I kind of had one more chance to prove it to them, which was the biggest tournament of the summer. And, guys like LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony, like the best players in the country. And I remember walking into the gym and the Stanford staff was sitting right there in front to watch me. And it was really my opportunity to try to get to Stanford to kind of fulfill my dream, but also to be close to my grandmother. And no one deserves it more than her because we're so close. So to have that special experience, I knew there was a lot riding on it. And the first game of that tournament, I scored 45 points. Not 30, right? Which is a lot, right? I never in my life had scored that much before or after. And so, yeah, by the grace of the game, like I feel like there was something cosmic happening where, I was meant to be close to my grandmother for those 4 years. And she didn't miss a game I played. She was at my dorm room every Sunday to drop off my clean laundry, to pick up my dirty laundry, to stock the fridge with food, very good food. She would clean my room, but she would even clean my roommates' rooms. And I would tell her, Anyu, you don't have to clean their rooms too. And she calls me Tatala, and she'd say, well, if my Tatala lives here, it all has to be clean. And so she would, she did it all. And we spent the most amazing 4 years together.
Yeah, I want to bounce around a little bit because
Yeah.
this is a great topic because you talk about your grandmother's relationship, and people who read the book and people who really understand you is, she actually was really devoted and supportive of you. She came to every home game, every college home game,
Mm-hmm.
and you guys were at the top of a competitive conference.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people understand how competitive the Pac-10, now Pac-12 was. You had a lottery players.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, Andre Iguodala was in that conference, and he's actually playing for the Golden State Warriors now. And he's probably a fringe Hall of Fame player, definitely a champion.
An Illinois native, by the way.
Yeah, Illinois native as well. Yeah. Can you talk about also the competitive aspect, but also just having your grandmother there just to actually witness this and share those memories with you, just as she got to see your father as well?
Yeah, it was incredible. And she would come to every game and she would drive with her friend Lily. And, my grandmother was in the Budapest ghetto, was saved twice by Raoul Wallenberg. Her friend Lily survived Auschwitz, and they would, my grandmother and Lily would come to my games together. My grandma would also come to some of my road games. So UCLA and Cal and USC. And so it was such a meaningful thing to have her there. And, I write in my book about this really traumatic injury I suffered, because I was the second leading scorer in the Pac-10 conference my junior year, and I was headed to the NBA. And my ultimate dream at that time was, I was about an inch from fulfilling it. And I took a wrong step during a game and I tore my ACL on national television, and it was very dramatic. And I was about 20 feet away from my grandma, and, I kind of lost my senses a little bit because I was panicking, and I was lying on the floor. And when I kind of came to, my grandmother was kneeling next to me, rubbing my head. She was there, and so even though that was it was a hard thing to go through, it's to this day a very formative experience in my life. But my grandma was right there, and it's symbolic too because that was something that I went through that was so devastating. Of course, you can never compare a knee injury to what my grandmother went through. She lost 5 siblings and both parents in the Holocaust, right? But she was always the first person to make space for me and my disappointments, and she supported me. She also inspired me because, that night after I knew the severity of my injury, and I kind of knew right away because you just know when bad things happen to your body, but we had dinner and I'm looking across the table at her, anything is possible. When I look at her, I know that. And from the Holocaust to build a family, what my dad achieved in the game of basketball, I knew that anything was possible. And so I just committed to my rehab, committed to, building the professional career I wanted. And, I didn't stick in the NBA, but I'm proud of the long, successful career I did have.
Yeah. And It's really interesting. And what really grabbed me was during that time of your injury, you actually allowed yourself to be human, because even though
Hmm.
your family overcame so much, and you have this rich family pride, you and in that vulnerable moment, you allowed yourself to soak, to be down.
Hmm.
You went through your tough state, where I remember reading, and you had this whole mapped out plan of what you wanted to do for your rehab, and how you were going to rebuild, you were going to be stronger physically and mentally. And then the next paragraph, you admitted that you didn't do any of that. You didn't even follow the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just remember just sitting back and laughing. I'm like, we've all been there. Well,
Yep.
we're determined and we have this plan, but it takes a time for us to get over it and get over ourselves. And I really appreciate that about your book, because it was honest.
Hmm.
And could you talk about that time of being at your lowest, and did you confide in your father and in your grandparents or other family members, and what did you take from them to help you overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did kind of mourn that injury in a lot of ways because it was so devastating. And, I was that year that it happened to me, my junior year at Stanford, I was the most improved player in the country. I had a very disappointing sophomore year, even though my team was the number one team. I had been a disappointment, and I really set my mind to proving everyone wrong and to working hard. And I did all those things, and I was so close. And then the injury happened. And so I did mourn that. But to your question, my dad came out for my surgery. So it was me, my grandma, and my dad in my grandma's apartment. And so they supported me every step of the way. And of course, my mom and my sister supported me as well from afar. But yeah, listen, I again, when I look at my grandma and my dad, and there's always hope for me, because they overcame unthinkable things. For my grandmother again to be, so close to dying herself in the Holocaust, and thank God she survived, and thank God Raoul Wallenberg was there for her twice. But to lose her family, my grandfather lost everyone. He came back with no one, parents, siblings, no one. And so, that's our history. And then for my dad to lose his brother in America, is also just a devastating loss. And so again, like to know what they've endured, how they've stayed positive, how they've continued to work, it's always given me inspiration. And so I'll try to apply that in my life, whatever my challenges are. And at that time, and I am honest about it, that was a challenge because, and we all go through them. If it's a knee injury, whatever it is, we all go through those challenges where we all have our moments where we need people to lift us up. We need hope. We need inspiration. And, that's one thing probably the main thing I hope people get from my book, because there's a lot of darkness in the story, but there's much more light. And so I always got so much inspiration from this story, and I hope other people who read it do also.
Absolutely. And you did bounce back, and you did recover, and you did overcome the odds, and you became a professional basketball player. 8 years,
Hmm.
not many people can say that the shelf life of a professional basketball year player is what, less than 2 years.
Hmm.
And you played 8 years, and you got your first opportunity to play in Germany. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what did that mean to your family to play in Germany, but also let's talk about your other two destinations afterwards, and where did you finish off in your career?
So I write in my book that I'm probably the only professional basketball player who had to call his grandmother to ask permission to sign the first professional contract because, I remember my agent calling me and saying, "Hey, I have a great opportunity for you to start your career." And I said, "Oh, great. Where is it?" He said, "It's in Germany." And I said, "Okay, well, I have to call my grandma because, of course, we all know that history." And so, I called her and I told her the news. And of course, she said, "Mazel tov, you have a chance to start your career." And I said, "Yeah, but there's a problem. It's in Germany." And she said, "Well, what's the problem?" So I thought, you might not be comfortable with that given everything that happened. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, "Sons are not responsible for the sins of their fathers," which is such an amazing kind of commentary on her perspective, where you can't blame this generation for what a prior generation had done. And she said to me, that's what people have done to Jews throughout history. They've blamed us for things that we weren't responsible for. And you can't do that to this generation. You should go to Germany. You should learn. You should, experience it, have a good time playing basketball. And that's what I did. And I did all those things. I had a successful year. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I also visited the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, or the memorial there. And we drove past the site of the Nuremberg rallies, the propaganda events in the 30s. And there was kind of a reckoning for me. And because of my family's history, and my best friend on the team that year was my age, and he was a German national team player. He was from Berlin. And so by the end of the year, we had gotten really close, and I told him about my family's history and about that, what I carried from that. But he told me about his family's history because his grandparents were on the other side of the war, and we kind of talked about the shame that his generation feels. And so there was a lot of healing actually from that experience. And so after that, I spent 3 years in Spain, which was amazing, great place to play, great place to live, and then finished my career in Israel, which was so meaningful. I went there for the first time in 2009 for the Maccabiah games, and within a few days, and my sister and my parents were there as well. I remember telling my sister, "This is where I'm finishing my career." It really felt like home. And when my grandparents and my dad and my uncle fled Romania, they had passports for Israel. And at the last minute they ended up coming to the United States, but most of my family settled in Israel, and that place was there for Jewish families after the Holocaust, and it's still there today. And with all the anti-Semitism and all the other issues in the world, Jews need Israel now like we needed Israel then. And so played 4 years there, played for the team in Jerusalem. So to, be the grandson of Holocaust survivors, my dad, the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust, to play with Jerusalem across my chest meant a lot. And, my dad finished his NBA career with the New York Knicks, and he wore number 18, which is a symbolic number in Judaism, of course. And so, for my dad to wear number 18 for the New York Knicks as a professional player, for me to play for Jerusalem, just amazing. And again, I'll hold up my book, right? By the grace of the game. It just was basketball that kind of did all these things for my family.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And let's get more into the book. When did you decide to actually write the book, and why did you choose a book format? Because certainly you have so much, um, you have a rich history, and there's so much you can use for it. Why did you think a book was the appropriate medium to tell this story? And when did you think about it?
So I thought about it when I was playing professional basketball towards the end of my career. I was doing a lot of writing. I had contributing writing positions to several, websites, and I published a lot of my stuff. And I always knew this was my story, and this always meant so much to me. I remember in college, interviewing my grandmother, taking notes in a notebook, and I was always really cared about this story, and it was something I wanted to tell. But as I got older, I got to know it better. It became more and more important to me. And then I retired from my professional career. I went to business school at Stanford, and I had a little bit of space to explore other things. And I remember telling my wife, now's the time. And I knew, like, if I'm going to do it, like, I'm going to do it. And this is not going to be a casual thing. And so, yeah, listen, it took me 5 years, and I did a year and a half of research just to understand, as you know, how complicated the history is, how much there is. I had to make sense of it all. So interviewed my grandmother, interviewed my dad, talked to family and friends all over the world, in Hungary, in Israel, in the States, leveraged other resources. And so when it was time to write my first draft, I did what I did as a basketball player. I told my wife that. I said, I have to approach this like I approach basketball, because basketball I didn't just fit it in when I could. My life basically revolved around it, And so for the book, it had to be the same way. And so I got up at 6:02 a.m. every day for 8 months. And I don't mean like once in a while, like every day. And that was the discipline from being a basketball player. And I just wrote, and after 8 months, I had my first draft. And so, again, it was a 5-year process end to end. I mean, the book came out 2 months ago, but I started working on it in 2016. So, it's been an incredible journey. I chose this form because this is what I love to do. I love to write, and I love to story tell in this way. And I've been, speaking to a lot of people because of the book, and people ask me, I have a family story that I want to share. What do you recommend? How should I do it? And I always say, first and foremost, know your story. That's really the most important thing, And for me, it's so rewarding that I talked to my grandma and my dad for a year and a half. I asked questions I never would have dreamed of asking if I didn't have a book in mind. And so I just think, first, you have to know your history, know your story, ask those questions. Once you've done that, I think you share it in whatever way is comfortable for you. So I like to write. I love to write. That's why I wrote the book. I have friends who love to make documentary films. They make documentary films. I have, of course, friends who don't like to do either. Maybe you just share some anecdotes over dinner, or maybe you just memorialize it for your family privately. You just take notes on it, whatever it is. But that's, I think, to know your story and to tell it in whatever way is comfortable for you is important. And for me, it was writing.
Yeah, and I'm interested in, because I'm sure you knew your family story growing up.
Mhm.
You've heard it, but when you interview them, you're now interviewing them from the lens of a writer researcher. So what did you learn about your dad and your grandmother and your family that you previously didn't know, and how far did you dig deep into it in these interviews as now as a writer, more so than a son or a grandson? How did you approach that process?
I went deep. I pulled every thread I could. I double clicked on everything that I thought was important, and I kind of made that promise to myself that, like, you can't hold back and you can't be afraid. And particularly with a story like this, there are hard details, and there were things that were there were questions that were very hard to ask. It was hard to ask him. It was hard to think about receiving an answer, but I did those things, and you get that in the book. This is deep. I go deep about myself. I go deep about my family, and I don't think I could have done that without just approaching it in a very honest and open way. And there was a lot of emotion throughout this process, interviewing, writing, and on both sides. There were tears shed, there were smiles, because the book is like that. You laugh, you cry, and
Yeah.
that's what life is like. And so certainly the interview process uh, was like that as well. And I learned so many details that I didn't know. What happened to my family in the Holocaust. No, I had one great aunt who came back from Auschwitz. I didn't know that she was evaluated there by Dr. Mengele, who's this notorious figure in history. I didn't know that. I learned that through research in the book. Very hard detail I learned about my family is, I mentioned my uncle passing away and what a tragedy that is. And, I'm named after my uncle. My middle name is Leslie after him. So I kind of, I've always carried that with me. And I was talking to my grandma about the day he passed, which of course is so hard. It's hard for everyone to talk about. And, at that time, my family lived in Queens, New York, but my grandfather was painting houses in Connecticut, because these are immigrants in America. He needed to kind of make ends meet. And he didn't have a car, so he just kind of caught rides with other people. And my grandma knew that my uncle wasn't doing well, and so she got in touch with him and said, "You need to get to the hospital immediately." And I asked her, did he make it in time? And she said, no, he didn't. And I never would have asked that really hard question if I weren't writing this book, and I never would have gotten that answer. And that's crushing, and I'll never forget that. I'll always know that. But you need to know your history, and so to know that my grandfather didn't get to say goodbye to his son, it's very hard. It's a very hard thing. And so there were details like that. But then on the other side, there were fun and uplifting things, understanding how my dad just became this huge basketball star and kind of what a sensation he was. And I'll share actually a story with you that's not in the book, but something that I learned. My dad was this incredible high school basketball player. And because I share this story, that my grandparents didn't see my dad play basketball until he was a junior in high school. They just knew it was something he did. They were working at their store all the time. And my grandfather was a great athlete in Romania. He was a world ranked ping pong player and kind of a semi-professional soccer player. So he was a great sportsman, but he just didn't know. And so they got a call at their fabric store from my dad's high school coach saying, you need to see him play. And the story goes that once they got into the gym, my grandfather, he asked my grandma, if he's so good, why isn't he on the court? And my grandmother said to him, look right there, that's Ernie. My grandfather couldn't even recognize him. He was in this little boy, right? But he had, evolved right before his eyes. And he told him on the court that day, because my grandpa used to make my dad come to their fabric store to work every weekend. And on the court, right after that first game, he said, you never come to the store again. Just work on your basketball. And so my dad became this phenomenon, All-American, one of the most highly recruited players in the country. So he went to the University of Tennessee. And he told me this story that, his first game as a freshman at Tennessee, he was a great high school player, but he didn't really know how it was going to go for him in college. This is a whole new level. And he was sitting at halftime, and maybe he had the stat sheet or someone said something to him, and he had 9 points in the first half. And he said to me, I remember thinking, wow, I have 9 points in the first half. So if I have 9 points in the second half, I'm going to have 18 points in my first college game. And that, maybe there's something here. And then he asked me, he said, how many points do you think I had in the second half? And I thought it was going to be like 0 or 2, and I said, I don't know what, like 2. And he said, no, I had 19 points in the second
Whoa.
half. So then he said, so I had 28 points for the game. And then I said to myself, this really could go well. And it did. And this, he graduated from Tennessee, the school's all-time leading scorer. He was the second leading scorer in the history of the SEC at that time, and that was in 1977. Today, he's still the 5th leading scorer in the history of the SEC. So, and yeah, he won a gold medal a few years after that for the United States. So it did go well for him with basketball. And it was just stories like that, I never would have known, and details, both sad and triumphant, I never would have had, and my family would never have had if I didn't kind of do this research and ask those questions.
Man, wow. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and it brings me back. You actually got to be around a lot of great NBA players.
Mm-hmm.
You actually was around Patrick Ewing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, probably the best center in the franchise's history, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah, also Jamaican.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that in the book, right? Because he was an
Yeah.
immigrant. My dad was an immigrant, so I mentioned that.
Yeah, I come from my grandparents were immigrants as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Patrick Ewing.
Yeah, amazing basketball player. My dad's last year as a player was Patrick Ewing's rookie year, and Patrick Ewing was the #1 pick in the NBA draft. He was clearly on his way to being a star, and he carried my dad's bags on the road. That was kind of like his rookie haze, and then my dad became the general manager of the team not so long after, and so I grew up around guys like that. And yeah, and by the way, since we're kind of talking about this evolution in the Knicks, again, by the grace of the game, my dad, after he lost his brother, he used to go to Madison Square Garden with my grandfather, to watch the Knicks, and they would sit in the bleachers in the cheap seats. My dad didn't speak English that well, and it was just, it was a chance for him just to kind of learn the language, heal, enjoy basketball a little bit. And then all these years later, not only is he playing for the team, but then he's the general manager of the team and the president of the team, right? So that's again why I wrote this story. Like, people know him certainly in New York, they know about this history, but they don't know where he started and how he got there.
Oh man, wow. And going back to the book, 2 questions. Who was the first person you shared the book with in your family, and what was their reception? And what was the reception of people maybe on your team and that you've worked with or come across? Were they cognizant of your family story? Like, how did they respond to learning so much personal details about you?
Yeah, so I'll tell you this. I worked on this book for 3.5 years without my family even knowing about it. And that's very atypical for my family, because we talk all the time. We tell each other everything. We're very close. But this story was so deep. I think I needed that space. Even when I was interviewing my grandma and my dad, I just told them I have a project in mind. I want to make sure we get all this history, but I just needed to be focused, and I needed to be like locked in on this. And so even my wife, who of course I live with, I told her, listen, I'm going to be working on something. I'm going to get up every morning to write. I don't want to really talk about it. I don't want to update about it. And so that's how insular I was throughout this process. Of course, so my wife was the first person to read it. I tried to meet a deadline that I set in my head. I went to Kinko's by our house. I had the first draft printed and bound, and I kind of presented it to her. I said, this is what I've been working on. She knew, she knew that generally, but, I kind of had set these guidelines. And so my wife was the first person to read it. She's a communications professional. She is an amazing editor, thought partner. And so she's probably read my book. I don't even want to tell you how many times, but, we kind of worked on it hand in hand for so long until I got it to a place where not only I told my parents, my sister, my grandmother, those close to me, about it. And then I had them read it, and I gave it to them all at the same time. My mom, my dad, my sister, and it was very emotional for everyone, and they're very proud of me. They're grateful I memorialized the history. But, for my dad, basketball allowed him to move away from these very hard things. And he didn't have to look back, and he never chose to look back because there's so much trauma there. And I talk a lot in the book about privilege, which we've already discussed. Another way I'm privileged is that I have a generation of separation from all this tragedy and trauma, and so I can look back on it. My dad doesn't have that luxury, right? So to relive these things, particularly for him, was very hard, but it was hard for everyone. But everyone's very proud of me. Everyone's very grateful that I've done this, and the reception has been incredible. I mean, publicly, right? Like last week, it was, as you know, it was International Holocaust Remembrance Day on Thursday. I was on Good Morning America, and I did the NBA on TNT. Like these are very meaningful things for me to just be able to talk about this story. And the response to the book and to the story has been incredible from those I don't know, but from those I do know. So to your question, like I've had every one of my college coaches has reached out to me about this, every one of them. And they because they knew me, they knew, I was a little stubborn, I was very motivated. And, after understanding where I come from, why I am the way I am, where my family's been, it gave them so much more context about me. And I think the story really, really moved them. So, and same with my teammates. Like every day I have people reach out to me about this story and about the impact that it's made on them, which to me is the most meaningful thing.
Absolutely. And you've held the book up a couple of times, and I don't think people can see it closely, but if you look at the very bottom, the foreword is written by no other than Ray Allen.
Yeah.
The Ray Allen, the one that made probably the greatest clutch shot in NBA history with the Miami Heat, but he also played for the Milwaukee Bucks. Can you talk about your relationship with Ray Allen? Also, how did he end up writing the forward to the book, and his commitment to just learning about the Holocaust and the Jewish history, which I found interesting and I didn't know until I read your book.
Yeah, so Ray Allen was recently named one of the top 75 basketball players in NBA history. So he's a living legend of the game of basketball. I'm lucky to know Ray and have a relationship with him because my dad was the general manager of the Milwaukee Bucks when Ray was a young player. So I was an up and coming high school player. I was a shooting guard. Ray Allen was a star shooting guard of the Bucks and one of the top players in the league. And he was always very good to me, someone I just always looked up to. So we know this about Ray. We know he's an amazing basketball player, but what's not well known, to your point, is that he was appointed to the board of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. by President Obama in 2016. He is a fierce advocate for Holocaust education, remembrance. He saw Schindler's List in college, and it moved him. He said to himself, this is not just a Jewish tragedy. This is a human tragedy. We need to know about this. We need to make sure this never happens again. And so he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He made it a mission of his to educate on the Holocaust. And so every time his teams played in Washington, D.C., he took teammates to the museum. He's taken trips to Auschwitz. And so, I've known Ray over the years. We hadn't talked in some time. We reconnected. I told him about the story, and he had no idea. He'd been to our home. He worked with my dad so closely. He didn't know my dad's background. And, when I asked him if he would support the story, if he would participate, he didn't hesitate. And he wrote such a moving forward. And so I'll tell you, like, as much as I looked up to him in high school, I look up to him even more now for the type of person he is.
Absolutely. Yeah, that blew me away. Like that, it just goes to show there's a story with so many of these athletes, and how no matter how different we are, we all can find a connection. And the history is just so deep. And because of this book you've written, it will not be forgotten. This will be a book that will be around for a long time. And I want to know, what did you hope to accomplish by writing this, and do you feel that sense of accomplishment?
Yeah. So what I hope to accomplish was kind of twofold. I want people to, again, like, take the same inspiration that I have from this story and have a feeling of hope and positivity. There are hard details here, but this is a happy story. When you read about a family who survived the Holocaust, fled communism, found a game, worked hard, treated people fairly, loved each other, that's a story that people can believe in. And so I always felt it in my life, and I kind of wanted to transmit that feeling to other people through the book. So that's one part. But the other part is I wanted to raise awareness about the Holocaust and to educate. My real dream is that kids will pick up this book because there's a really interesting, fun basketball story. And in so doing, they'll learn what happened and they'll tell their friends about it, and it'll never be forgotten. Because my grandmother's always said to me, we need to tell these stories, because if we don't, no one else will. And it could happen again, and not just to Jewish people, to any people. And so for me, wanted to kind of share the hope of the story. Also wanted to shine a light on the Holocaust in doing that.
Absolutely. And you did just that. And my last question before we transition to the audience Q&A, and and it goes back to your research phase when you were interviewing your parents, your grandparents. Um, can you talk about what is the American dream for your family? Because that's something that comes up. What does that symbolizes for your family? Because it's specific for different people and different families. What does that mean for you and your family?
Yeah, and so the subtitle of my book, it says an unprecedented American dream, right?
Yeah,
And that's because my dad, is the only player in major sports whose parents survived the Holocaust. He won a gold medal for the United States not that long after he got to America. So my grandparents closed their fabric store. They drove to Montreal and they watched their son stand on top of the Olympic podium in the Stars and Stripes with a gold medal around his neck, right? That's just an incredible story. But my family was living the American dream before that. And how I would define that is they just had opportunity. They had an opportunity to work, to build a life. They had freedom. They could say, they had the freedom to say what they believed. And so, listen, America was not perfect then. It's not perfect now. There are a lot of issues that they dealt with, that we still deal with as a society. But coming from the Holocaust, coming from communism, to be in the United States of America, where you could work for a living and have the opportunity to raise your kids, have them get an education, that was an American dream right there. And for my dad to find basketball and for it to become what it became, kind of made it a story that you could write a book about, but it was still meaningful just to have a chance to build a life. And I want to circle back to something, because I didn't answer the last part of your prior question, which was, do I feel accomplished? And actually, it's an interesting question, and this from the book, that it's always been, it's a weakness of mine, but weaknesses are strengths and strengths are weaknesses, right? So
yeah,
to not allow yourself to be satisfied, you continue to push, and so I think that can be a good quality, but there's a point of diminishing returns, which I definitely reached throughout my basketball career, which you'll see in the book. But so I have a hard time stopping to smell the roses, patting myself on the back, really truly being satisfied. But for this, the fact that people are reading about my grandmother, and a lot of people are reading about it because the book is doing well, and I'm very, very proud to say that I do. I really feel a sense of accomplishment from this, probably more so, definitely more so than anything I ever did on the basketball court, because this is so much bigger and means so much more to me. So thank you
yeah.
for asking that question, because it it actually helped me kind of think through, because listen, and it's on
That's
the
exactly
pages, like,
why I asked.
yeah,
You know,
they're soul searching in that question.
in reading the book, I was just able to identify with some of those introspective moments, and I really wanted to know that because, um, and being an athlete, I told you I ran track in college,
Hmm.
and you be playing basketball in college. Sometimes we don't never stop and smell the roses because it's
Hmm.
always you taught the next thing up, the next rep, the next shot, the next race. You never get time to rest on your laurels and celebrate. So I was just interested because that's very tough to turn off after years of conditioning. And I was really interested to see were you able to find that. And I'm glad you feel accomplished.
Thank you, man. It's still a work in progress. Don't get me wrong. You know how it is. Those instincts are deep, but yeah, I do.
All right. Well, thank you. And we're going to transition to the audience Q&A. So if you do have questions, please submit them. We're going to get to as many as we can. We would love to keep this discussion going. So we're going to start it off with the first question. Have you traveled to the town where your grandparents and father came from?
It's a great question. I have not. I've been to Romania. I write about it in the book. I played for the Romanian national basketball team, which is also kind of ironic that my dad grew up under communism in Romania, the son of Holocaust survivors, won a gold medal for the United States. I grew up, in an affluent suburb of New Jersey. My dad, the GM of the Knicks, and I played for the Romanian team. So our stories kind of intersect in those ways. But so I've been in Romania, but I've never been to Satmar, which is where my family is from. I will go one day just because it is so important to our history. They didn't leave. It wasn't happy terms, right? They fled. They weren't allowed to bring anything out. Although, Raheem, as you know, they took all their illegal money out, and you'll have to read the book to find out how. But my grandparents had chutzpah. They got their money out in a very improbable way. But yeah, so I want to go there one day. And really, another city that I've never been to that I have to go to is Budapest, because that's where my grandmother survived the Holocaust. That's where she was in the Budapest ghetto. That's where Raoul Wallenberg saved her. And I've never been to Budapest. And so, yeah, I will take that trip. I'll bring my family to see kind of where we started, not only in Romania, but in Hungary.
All right. Did your dad face anti-Semitism as a basketball player or as an executive?
So we all, as Jews in America or anywhere in the world, you experience it in some way, right? And I write this in the book. Anti-Semitism, even if it's not apparent to the naked eye, it's always there under the surface, whether it's a comment or direct or indirect, or you always feel it. But if you ask my dad that question, and I have, he says no, because he was, and you can see this in the story, how deep his tie to basketball was and how it took him away from all these hard things. He was just head down, enjoying the game of basketball, and he was busy scoring points. It's like he was just playing the game. He went to the University of Tennessee, which is down south, and he teamed with an all-time great Bernard King. They were called the Ernie and Bernie show. They're one of the greatest duos in college basketball history. Bernard is a black man from Brooklyn. My dad is a white immigrant from Queens. They went to Knoxville and became legends. And Bernard has been very open about some of the racism he experienced in Knoxville. And people ask my dad about anti-Semitism, and he says, if it was there, I didn't feel it, And so that was his experience. And I can tell you from my experience, I didn't feel anti-Semitism as a basketball player, but I felt it throughout my life as a human being, whether, again, comment, jokes, different type of things.
All right. And are you aware of any Jewish players in the NBA?
Yes, there is. So for the Washington Wizards, Deni Avdija, who's an Israeli player, actually he's from the city of Herzliya, which is where I played 2 years. So I played 2 years in Jerusalem, 2 years in Herzliya, and he was a member of our youth program, unbeknownst to me at the time. He was like an 11 or 12-year-old kid. Now, come to find out, he was like a lottery pick in the NBA draft. So yes, he's a good player for the Wizards. Very proud to have him in the NBA doing well, but there aren't many. I think he's the only one currently. So yeah, and when the NBA started and when basketball started, it was a largely Jewish game. And I detailed this in the book. The first NBA game was played by the Toronto Huskies and the New York Knicks, and all 5 members of the Knicks starting lineup were Jewish. The first basket in NBA history was scored by a guy named Ozzie Sheckman from Kew Gardens, Queens. So, wow. And that was a year after Auschwitz was liberated. And so it was basketball and Judaism deep roots together. But today, currently, not as much in the NBA, although there's a strong league in Israel. Maccabi Tel Aviv is a great team, so there is still that history, but not as much in the NBA.
All right. Can you talk about the impact of your time with Fred as it transformed your physical and mental ability?
Yeah. So Frank, yeah. Frank was my trainer who I worked with, and Raheem's laughing because he's read about Frank. Frank is an interesting character. People call him Hell's Trainer or Crazy Frank. It all kind of fits, although there's a method behind his madness, and he's a great person. But he trained people for the military, and it was an extreme form of training. And I really took to that because I was so motivated and determined to make something of myself as a basketball player, to live up to this legacy, to make people proud, to honor the history. All those things were wrapped up in it. And I was just, would do anything to succeed. And so I did some pretty extreme training, and Frank was, is a character, and you'll read a lot of funny things about him in the book, but also a lot he taught me. One of the main things he taught me, and when I was working out with him, and because he would really push me, and he calls everyone sir, every man, he'll call him sir, sir, and he would always say, sir, your mind will give out before your body. Your mind will give out before your body. Like when you think you can't, you can. It's only your mind. And at first, it was frankly annoying and painful because he was pushing me so hard. But then I started to believe him, and then I started to understand it was true. And so, but he also, like, he knew when to pull me back, right? And that's the genius of him as a trainer. And so I averaged 3.4 points per game my sophomore year at Stanford. I averaged 18 points per game my junior year. It wasn't all because of him, but he had a lot to do with it.
Absolutely.
He had a lot to do with it.
Yeah. And the last thing is not a question, it's a comment, but I think you will really appreciate it. So I'm going to read it.
Okay.
My husband attended University of Tennessee with your dad. As fabulous of an athlete, your dad continued to play pickup games on concrete courts with other students. My husband had the opportunity to play a pickup game with him. My husband is not anywhere a professional athlete. Fond memories from my husband.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that detail. And so you'll read in the book, my dad learned the game of basketball on the outdoor courts in New York City. And so he always kind of stayed true to his roots. And, he, to this day, like, he's a very just humble, approachable person. And again, you read the book, you understand where he comes from, and you'll get why he's like that. He knows, how what's at stake in life when people aren't treated fairly. And so he's just a very down to earth guy. And so it doesn't surprise me that when he was, this celebrity in Tennessee and this all-star and all-American, he was just playing on the outdoor courts because, he loved the game and loved to, play it with people.
Absolutely. And well, we just got one more question. So we're going to make this the last question. All right. Do you have children? What do you hope for your kids to one day get out of your book as they learn about your wonderful family?
Thank you for that question, because it's the most important one, right? Because this book is about family. I'm about family. And I have I was going to say 2.5, but he's almost 3. So my son will be 3 in April.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And he will be joined by a baby brother in April. And so we have another one on the way, which is very exciting. And yeah, listen, I'm all about family. And yeah, you'll get this from the book, and how this story is now my kids' story, because it is. They hold this history just like I do, and now they'll be able to pick up a book and know it and feel it and carry it and give it to their kids. And so that's the most meaningful thing about the book. Listen, you could be on Good Morning America, NBA on TNT, do this great program with, the Holocaust Center in Illinois. But for me to be able to pass this down to my children, and for them to know what their ancestors went through, what our family's been through, to know that you should always stay positive, have hope, treat people the right way. That's the greatest gift. And so, right into your past question about feeling accomplished, that's really the feeling of accomplishment, is knowing that I've done that for my kids, because nothing is more important than that.
Absolutely. Wow. This has been incredible. I was really excited leading up to this program. I know we've been in communication. I read the book almost twice. I was rereading heading to the program, and to the people in attendance, if you haven't had a chance to read the book, please do. And if you have, share the story with someone. This is an opportunity to learn, but you will also laugh. It's just an incredible book. And
Thank you.
with 5 minutes left, I just leave you the floor, Dan. If you have anything you want to share with our audience or anything you want to get out there, please do.
First of all, I want to thank you, Raheem. You've been a great in-conversation partner tonight, great partner planning this event, and all the folks at the Holocaust Museum in Illinois. Just thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this story. And thanks to everyone who came tonight and listened. I mean, this is so meaningful for me, just to be able to share it. As Raheem said, it would mean the world if you pick up the book, read it, gift it to someone you care about. This is a history that we always have to remember, and so that is such a meaningful thing. And I'm just extremely grateful. So I just want to leave you with the words, thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you again for everyone attending the program and supporting us. Please support Dan and his family and purchase the book. Please follow the link to the survey and the chat. We will love your feedback. Also, please visit our website to see our upcoming programs. We have a bunch of great things planned for the rest of the year. And Dan, where can they find you and support you going forward?
Yeah, so social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. I'm on all those things. I'm not the most active in the world, but I love to connect with people. I do have a book website, dangrunfeld.com, if you're interested in learning more about the story. And the book's been doing well, which is really exciting. We're trying to promote independent bookstores, but it's sold out there. Still have copies on Amazon, and yeah, would just be so grateful for folks engaging with the story, and anyone who wants to reach out further can do so through my website, through Facebook. I do love to connect, so please don't be strangers. And I went to high school in Milwaukee. My wife went to Northwestern. My father-in-law is from Skokie. We still have family in Illinois, in Chicago, and in Milwaukee, and so this is very, very meaningful for me to talk to this group today.
Well, thank you. And once again, thanks to everyone in attendance. I hope to see you all in the next program. And then I will be following your work and supporting whatever you got going on in the future.
Can't thank you enough for you. You've been awesome, man. Thank you so much.
No problem. Everyone have a good
All
night.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you.